Good morning, 8th grade. It is Tuesday, April 21st. We are back in American history, and we're going to be reading pages 358 to 360 today into the 70s. Now, you have quiz 38 to do today, so before we begin this lesson, I'd like you to go ahead and take your quiz. Remember, you can use the books, your notes, whatever you have to do so, and then come back to the video. Alright, hopefully that quiz wasn't too tough for you guys. We only have a few pages to read today, so we're going to begin on page 358 in the bottom corner. We're going to be talking about the 1970s. We're going to start with President Richard Nixon. In March of 1968, President Johnson addressed the nation saying that he wanted peace talks to end the Vietnam War. Toward the end of his speech, he made a surprise announcement. He was not going to run for re-election. With LBJ out of the running, several Democratic candidates contended for the presidential election campaign. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, emerged as the strongest Democratic contender for presidency. But while campaigning in 1968 in California, he was assassinated by Sirhan Bashar Sirhan. Thus, Vice President Hubert Humphrey ran against the Republican candidate Richard Nixon, and Governor George C. Wallace of Alabama, who ran on a third-party ticket. Nixon, who had lost to JFK in 1960, won the presidential election this time. Now we're going to talk about the environmental movement, starting with nature worship. The Nixon era saw the rise of the environmental movement. God has built into the human heart an understanding that there is more to the universe than merely matter in motion. Because everyone is inclined to worship something, pantheism, or the worship of nature, has always appealed to mankind. In the 1970s, the spiritual emptiness brought about by evolution and other liberal ideas caused many people, including some scientists, to put their faith in a kind of pantheism called New Age environmentalism. In 1970, the first International Earth Day was celebrated. Earth Day continues to be a major celebration for the environmental movement. And conservation comes. There are some good things that come from this natural movement, such as conservation. Most Americans were rightly concerned about clean air and water and wanted to practice wise stewardship of our nation's natural resources. They also realized that technology and development had improved their lives. They agreed with Teddy Roosevelt that preservation of the wilderness should be balanced with conservation practices. However, radical environmentalists began to view mankind as the enemy of nature rather than its steward. They became more concerned with preserving nature than with nature benefiting mankind. Radical environmentalists seemed to worship nature. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God. They became fools and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things, quoting Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 23, that they knew nature was from God, but they attributed nature to nature rather than to God. By the 1970s, political environmentalists had enough support to pass laws that hurt private property owners and hindered the advance of technology. Building contractors, business owners, and homeowners had severe restrictions placed on the use of their own property, as costly government inspections, licenses, fees, and regulatory agencies brought tight government control. And now we're going to talk about the final abandonment of Vietnam. Nixon had promised to get America out of Vietnam by training the South Vietnamese to fight for themselves, but most military generals did not think this plan would work. In 1969, President Nixon began withdrawing American troops from South Vietnam, but in April 1970, he admitted that he had ordered American troops into Cambodia to destroy communist bases there. Vietnam War protesters accused the president of going back on his promise to get the troops out of Southeast Asia. Angry and violent demonstrations on college campuses led to the deaths of 4 students at Kent State University. In Ohio, 2 students at Jackson State College in Mississippi. President Nixon increased his efforts to end the war until a ceasefire was finally declared in January 1973. The communists agreed to return all American prisoners of war. However, it is doubtful that all were returned. Many MIAs, or soldiers missing in action, were never accounted for. Americans were alarmed to hear about the brainwashing tactics and inhumane tortures used by the North Vietnamese communists on American prisoners of war. By March 1973, all American troops were out of Vietnam, and more than 57,000 Americans had lost their lives in this war. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. commemorates the troops each by name. And so let's take a little side note off of the Vietnam War to talk about America putting a man on the moon. In 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. Millions of people watched by live telecast as he stepped out of the lunar landing onto the dusty surface of the moon. His first words were, "That is one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." The moon mission did not reveal clues to the origin of the universe as some had hoped it would. After almost a day of experimenting, collecting, and exploring, the astronauts returned as national heroes. So now let's turn back to Vietnam and learn about the fall of South Vietnam. No sooner were American troops out of Vietnam than the North Vietnamese communists launched a new assault against South Vietnam. On April 23, 1975, President Ford officially announced the end of American involvement in Vietnam, ordering the evacuation of U.S. civilians and embassy personnel. On April 30, 1975, Saigon, South Vietnam's capital, fell to communist forces, and the communists gained complete control of Vietnam. About 130,000 Vietnamese managed to escape by fleeing by boat to the United States. Unfortunately, the communists quickly extended their control to Cambodia and Laos. In Cambodia, the communists sought to destroy families and private property by murdering over 2.5 million men, women, and children. The communist threat also spread to Indonesia and the Philippines, where valuable resources had to be expended to prevent a complete communist takeover. One result of the Vietnam conflict was the 26th Amendment. Several young men did not agree that they could be considered old enough to die for their country, but not old enough to vote. With the ratification of the 26th Amendment, the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18. Eventually, the military draft ended, and only volunteers enlisted in the armed forces. So also, let's talk about quickly some other foreign affairs under Nixon. So, SALT I. President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, made several important agreements with communist countries, including the ceasefire in Vietnam. And we're going to learn more about some more of these communist treaties and negotiations tomorrow. Just had a short reading today because you took quiz 38, so make sure you read up to the end of page 360 there, and we will pick this up tomorrow on Wednesday, guys. I hope you have a good day.